It's 10 p.m. on April 24th, 1951, and Lieutenant Mike Levy is crouching in a shallow foxhole on Hill 677 in Korea. He's listening to something that makes his blood run cold, the sound of thousands of steps moving through the darkness, whistles piercing the night air, and then he sees them, wave after wave of Chinese soldiers emerging from the shadows. Their faces painted white to terrify the enemy, bugles blaring, and they're screaming as they charge straight up the hill toward his position. Levy commands just 30 men in 10 platoon. D Company. But what's coming at them right now is an entire Chinese division. Nobody knows it yet, but in the next 8 hours, 700 Canadian soldiers from the 2nd Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry will face approximately 5,000 battle-hardened troops from 2 Chinese divisions, the 118th and 60th, in one of the most desperate and brutal night battles in Canadian military history. And here's what nobody, Canadians, nobody are completely alone. They're surrounded, cut off from all reinforcements, and they're about to make a stand that will save Seoul from falling back into enemy hands. But wait, because the story gets even more insane. Let me take you back 48 hours to show you how 700 Canadians ended up in this impossible situation. It's April 22nd, 1951, and the Korean War has been raging for nearly a year. The 2nd Battalion PPCLI, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Riley Stone, a decorated World War II veteran who fought through Sicily and Italy, has been stationed north of the Kapyong Valley in central Korea as part of the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade. They've been pushing north for weeks as part of Operation Rugged, driving Chinese and North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel. The men are exhausted. They've been in continuous combat for 7 months. And they're finally getting a break. They're being pulled back to reserve positions, to rest, and some units are even being rotated back to Hong Kong. The Australians from 3 RAR are nearby. The British Middlesex Regiment is there, and New Zealand artillery is in support. Everything seems under control. But at exactly 500 p.m. on April 22nd, everything changes. 337,000 Chinese troops launch the massive spring offensive, slamming into UN positions across the entire Western and Central Front. Their objective is simple and terrifying. Recapture Seoul, destroy the American I and IX Corps, and drive the UN forces into the sea. The main attack hits the British 29th Brigade on the Imjin River to the west, but a secondary thrust with 149,000 troops is aimed directly at the South Korean 6th Division, which is holding positions at the northern end of the Kapyong Valley. Here's where it gets crazy. The Chinese 118th Division and 60th Division, part of the 40th Army under Commander Win Yuchun, hit the South Koreans like a sledgehammer, the Rauke Fin says, after halting out 1 hour to prepare defenses after halting their advance. And their positions are scattered across hilltops, with the valleys completely exposed. By nightfall on April 22nd, the South Korean lines are collapsing. Thousands of RK soldiers are streaming south through the Kapyong Valley in complete chaos. Some without weapons, many wounded, all running for their lives with Chinese forces in hot pursuit. And standing directly in the path of this human tsunami are the Canadians and Australians of the 27th Brigade. At 8:00 a.m. on April 23rd, Brigadier Brian Burke receives urgent orders. The brigade must immediately deploy forward to blocking positions in the Kapyong Valley to cover the South Korean withdrawal and stop the Chinese advance. On Seoul, the Australian from 3 RAR are ordered to take Hill 5004 on the east side of the valley the Canadians from 2PP CLI are ordered to occupy Hill 677 on the west, 677, the west side, about 2 kilometers south of the Australians. And here's the problem. These aren't prepared defensive positions. There are no bunkers, no barbed wire, no mines, nothing. Just bare hilltops where the men have to frantically dig foxholes while thousands of panicked South Korean soldiers pour through their positions. Lieutenant Stone arrives at 6 and 77 with his 700 men around noon on April 23rd, and he looks at the terrain and immediately understands what's coming. Hill 6, 7, and 7. So it's what's coming. He understands all steep and rugged. Covered with scrub brush and scattered trees, with a narrow ridgeline running along the top from the summit, he can see the entire valley below and Hill 504, where the Australians are digging in Stone, a veteran of some of the most brutal fighting in World War II, gathers his company commanders and delivers a simple order that will become legendary. Be steady, kill, and don't give way. The Canadians start digging, a company under Major E.L. Cohen takes positions on the right flank, B Company under Captain J.A. Mills covers the center. C Company secures the left, D Company under Captain John Mills. Mike Levy's company is positioned on the most forward slope of the hill. And here's what makes this terrifying. As the Canadians are still digging the afternoon of April foxholes on the afternoon, April 23rd, they can see the battle developing to the north, smoke rising from villages, the sound of artillery, and then the flood begins. Thousands of South Korean soldiers stumbling down the valley road, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted, some crying, and behind them you can hear it. The whistles and bugles of the Chinese forces advancing. Stone watches through his binoculars and counts the enemy forces moving south. He estimates at least 2 full Chinese divisions, possibly more. That's minimum 20 Zhaozhen troops, and his battalion has exactly 700 men. But Stone doesn't order a retreat. Instead, he radios brigade headquarters and requests maximum artillery support, air drops of ammunition, and he tells his men to dig deeper. That night, April 23rd into 20th, the Canadians can hear heavy fighting from Hill 504, where the Australians are engaged Tracer's Arc across the dark valley. Explosions light up. The Chinese have found Humphrey Rar, and they're attacking in waves. The Australians fight magnificently, holding their position against overwhelming odds, killing hundreds of Chinese soldiers. But by late afternoon on April 24th, the Australian position becomes untenable. They've suffered 155 casualties, including 32 killed. They're nearly out of ammunition, and Chinese forces have infiltrated around their flanks. At 4:00 p.m., the Australians receive permission to withdraw to reserve positions near brigade headquarters. And just like that, the Canadians on Hill 6 and 77 are completely alone. The Chinese 118th Division, having pushed past the Australians, now turns its full attention to the last obstacle between them and the open road to Seoul. 700 Canadians on a hilltop with no support, no reinforcements possible. And night is falling. Lieutenant Colonel Stone receives a radio message from brigade asking if he wants to withdraw. His response is immediate and defiant. No, we stay. This is ground worth dying for. And here's what nobody knows yet. In the next 12 hours, these 700 Canadians will stop an estimated 5,000 Chinese soldiers from 3 attacking regiments. They'll call artillery fire on their own positions. They'll fight hand to hand in their foxholes, and they'll refuse to give 1 inch of ground. But first, let me tell you about the men who are about to face this nightmare. Private Wayne Mitchell, just 22 years old, from Galt, Ontario, a Bren gunner in B Company. Private Kenneth Barwise, age 20, from Winnipeg, Manitoba, manning a Vickers machine gun in D Company. Lieutenant Mike Levy, age 23, commanding 10 platoon in D Company on the most forward position on the hill. These are farmers' sons, factory workers, shop clerks. Most of them barely old enough to drink, many of them still teenagers, and they're about to fight the battle of their lives. As darkness falls on April 24th at approximately 7:30 p.m., an eerie silence settles over Hill 677. The men have been in their foxholes for 30 hours now. Some have managed to eat cold rations. Most are surviving on adrenaline and fear. They can see the valley below, filled with movement. Shadows shifting in the twilight. And then Stone's radio crackles. It's a forward observation officer reporting. Massive enemy concentration forming at the base of Hill 677. Estimate 2,000 to 3,000 troops. They're preparing to assault your position. Stone calmly passes the word to his company commanders. Here they come, boys. Make every shot count. And at exactly 15 p.m., the Chinese artillery opens up a mortars, start raining down on the Canadian. Positions explosions tear through the hillsidey earth and shrapnel spray everywhere. Men press themselves into their shallow foxholes as the barrage intensifies. This goes on for 25 minutes, and then suddenly it stops in the ringing silence. Finally a silence that fall. The Canadians hear it, whistles in the darkness. Bugles blowing and voices shouting in Chinese. Private Mitchell peers over the edge of his foxhole, and what he sees makes his heart stop. The entire hillside below him is moving. Hundreds of Chinese soldiers in quilted uniforms are advancing up the slope in human wave. The slope in human waves. Just dark shapes in the moonlight. Coming on in complete silence, now except for the rustling of equipment and footsteps in the brush. Mitchell flips off his Bren gun's safety and waits. The Chinese are 100 meters away, 75 meters, 50 meters. And then the order comes down the Canadian line. Fire! The hillside explodes with gunfire. Bren guns hammering, rifles cracking, the Vickers machine guns chattering out their deadly rhythm. Tracer rounds streak down the slope into the mass of advancing Chinese soldiers. Men are falling, screaming. But more keep coming wave after wave. They're using a tactic called human wave attacks, where they just keep sending men forward, regardless of casualties, trying to overwhelm the defenders by sheer numbers. Mitchell is firing bursts, changing magazines. Firing again, his Bren barrel is getting hot. The Chinese reach 30 meters from the Canadian positions. 20 meters, some of the attackers are throwing grenades now. Explosions rip through the night. And then Mitchell feels a massive impact in his chest. He's been shot blood across his uniform. But here's where this story becomes legendary. Instead of falling back for Medicadremin, instead of falling back for medical treatment. Private Wayne Mitchell picks up his Bren gun and charges forward into the attacking Chinese soldiers. He's wounded, bleeding, probably in shock. But he's running down the slope firing from the hip, screaming at the enemy. And the Chinese soldiers nearest to him break and run. Mitchell keeps firing until his magazine is empty. Then he charges back up to his position, reloads, and does it again, and then a third time. 3 times this wounded Canadian private charges into an enemy force that outnumbers his entire company. and 3 times he drives them back later. For this action, Mitchell will receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal, one of the highest awards for bravery in the Commonwealth. But right now, on the night of April 24th, he's just trying to keep his friends alive. Meanwhile, on the forward slope of Hill 6 and 77, Lieutenant Mike Levy's 10 platoon in D Company is facing the worst of it. Levy has only 30 men, and they're the most exposed position on the entire hill. The Chinese have identified this as a weak point, and they're throwing everything at by 10:00 p.m. Levy's position has been hit by 3 successive waves of attackers. His men are running low on ammunition. They're fighting with rifles, grenades, anything they can grab. Some are throwing rocks when their ammunition runs out. And the Chinese just keep coming. Levy radios his company commander, Captain John Mills, and his message is desperate. "We're about to be overrun. I need help now, or we're finished." Mills looks at the tactical situation and realizes there's only one option. He gets on the radio to Lieutenant Colonel Stone and makes an unthinkable request. "Sir, I need you to call artillery fire directly on the 10 platoon's position. It's the only way to stop them." Stone hesitates. What Mills is asking means firing New Zealand 25 pounder artillery shells on his own men. It could kill Levy and everyone in 10 platoon. But if they don't do it, the Chinese will break through, roll up the entire Canadian line, and everyone on Hill 677 will die. Stone makes the hardest decision of his life. He approves the fire mission within minutes. The New Zealand gunners of 16th Field Regiment have the coordinates there, located several kilometers south, and they can't see the target. They're firing on radio directions alone, and they're about to drop high explosive shells on Canadian soldiers at 10:23 p.m. The first shells scream overhead. Levy hears them coming and shouts to his men, "Get down! Get in your holes! Cover your heads." The shells impact just 25 meters in front of Levy's position. The explosions are massive, the ground shakes down, and the Chinese soldiers advancing on 10 platoon are torn to pieces by the blasts. More shells come in, 238 shells than an hour. That's more New Zealand gunners falchion. Their barrels are glowing red on the hillside in front of Levy's. Preserve the inferno is churned between an explorer and St. Louis and Broner. Miraculously, Levy and his men survive, huddled in their foxholes just meters from where the shells are landing. They can feel the heat and concussion of each blast. Their ears are bleeding from the overpressure. But they're alive, and when the barrage finally lifts at 11:17 p.m., the Chinese attack on the 10 platoon has been completely destroyed. Hundreds of enemy soldiers lie dead on the slope. The survivors are retreating back down the hill. Levy crawls out of his foxhole, checks his men. They're all alive, though several are wounded, and he radios Captain Mills. "We're still here. They didn't get us. For this action, Lieutenant Mike Levy will receive nothing, no medal, no recognition, just the satisfaction of knowing he and his platoon held the line when it mattered most. It won't be until 2003, more than 50 years later, that Governor General Adrienne Clarkson will grant him a coat of arms in belated recognition. But that's a scandal for another day. Right now, it's nearly midnight on April 24th, and the battle is far from over. While 10 Platoon was fighting for survival, Private Kenneth Barwise in D Company witnessed his Vickers machine gun position get overrun by Chinese soldiers. The two, Man crew was killed and the Chinese captured the gun. This is a disaster because that Vickers was providing critical covering fire for the entire company. Without it, there's a huge gap in the defensive line. Barwise, who was nearby in a different position, sees what happened, and he makes a decision that defies all military logic. This 20-year-old kid from Winnipeg stands up in the middle of a firefight, runs through withering enemy fire toward the captured gun position, kills 6 Chinese soldiers with his rifle and grenades, grabs the 30-pound Vickers machine gun, and sprints back to Canadian lines with bullets snapping past his ears. He single-handedly recovers the gun, sets it up in a new position, and continues firing. For this act of insane bravery, Barwise will receive the military medal. But again, that's later. Right now, he's just trying to stay alive. The Chinese launch another major assault at 12:45 a.m. on April 25th in the center of the Canadian line. Approximately 400 Chinese soldiers come screaming at by using grenades and subsem guns at point-blank range, hand canning. Brexite and the Fossilines are fighting with rifle butts. Fighting butts down with fighting with rifles. Bayonets, knives. It's brutal, savage, desperate. Private Mitchell, still bleeding from his chest wound, is firing his Bren gun until it runs dry. Then he's throwing grenades. Then he's hitting Chinese soldiers with his entrenching tool. All around him men are fighting and dying in the darkness. The Chinese break through the first line of foxholes. They're among the Canadian positions now. It looks like the line is going to collapse. And then something incredible happens. The Canadians counterattack, led by their platoon. Canadians of Atlantic land, led by their platoon commanders. They charge forward with bayonets fixed and drive the Chinese back. It's desperate, bloody work, but somehow they push the enemy off the hill. By 1:30 a.m., the Chinese attack has failed. Bodies are scattered across the slope. Canadian and Chinese dead, lying intermingled in the foxholes, are the survivors on both sides are catching their breath for the next round. Lieutenant Colonel Stone, from his command post, has been coordinating the defense brilliantly. He's moving his limited reserves to threatened points. He's calling in artillery fire on every Chinese concentration he can spot. He's on the radio constantly, encouraging his company commanders, directing fire missions, refusing to show any sign of fear, even though he knows his battalion is hanging by a thread at 2:15 a.m. Stone receives a radio message from brigade headquarters. They're asking if he needs to withdraw. The Australians have already pulled back. The South Koreans have collapsed. The Canadians are completely isolated. And there's no possibility of reinforcement or relief until daylight. Stone's response is immediate. Negative. We hold this position. The enemy will not pass. And when his radio operator asks if he's sure, Stone says something that becomes the motto of the battle. This is ground worth dying for. The Chinese regroup and attack again at 300 a.m. This assault is even larger. They've brought up reinforcements from the 60th Division. The estimates are that somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 Chinese soldiers are now attacking Hill 6077 simultaneously from multiple directions. They're hitting multiple directions. They're hitting A Company on the right flank, reinforcements and Werpeny on the right flank, B Company in the center, and making another push against D Company on the forward slope. The noise is incredible. Machine guns, mortars, grenades, shouting, screaming. The entire hilltop is lit up by muzzle flashes and explosions. and the Canadians are running critically low on ammunition. Men are down to their last few magazines. The Vitters halves are almost out of belts. 2-inch mortars have fired all their bombs. Sion Rayos back to Brigade Ernert, with Brigade in quarters with an urgent request. We need ammunition resupply immediately, or we won't last until dawn. But there's a problem. The Chinese have infiltrated so close to the Canadian positions that it's cut off. No trucks can get through, and it's too dangerous to send men on foot with ammunition. The only option is an airdrop at 345. AIM. A U.S. Air Force C-119 flying boxcar transport plane comes roaring over Hill 677 at low altitude. The crew are flying without lights, navigating by the muzzle flashes from the battle below, and they kick out bundles of ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Some of the bundles land in Canadian lines, some land in Chinese positions, and some land in no man's land between the two forces. Stone immediately organized preliminary parties. Groups of 3 to have the strength have sprimplive bundles, while Chinese soldiers are Canadians and Netherlands are advantaged to bring enough ammunition to keep fighting. By 4:30 a.m. in Canadians are reloaded and ready, and just in time, because the Chinese launch yet another assault. This pattern continues through the darkest hours of the night. Chinese attack. Canadians repel them with rifles and machine guns and artillery. Brief lull. Chinese attack again. It's like fighting a hydra. You cut down one wave and 2 more appear. The Canadian casualty count is climbing. Men are being killed and wounded every few minutes. The aid station behind the front line is overwhelmed with wounded, and not one Chinese soldier makes it past the Canadian foxholes. Not 1 inch of ground is given when foxholes whole. At 5:47 a.m. on April 25th, something changes. The Chinese attack stops, the gunfire dies away, and in the growing twilight, the Canadians can see the enemy withdrawing down the hillside. They're not retreating in panic. It's an organized tactical withdrawal. But they're leaving after 10 hours of continuous assault. After throwing thousands of men at Hill 677, after suffering catastrophic casualties, estimated at more than 2,000 killed and wounded, the Chinese 118th Division and 60th Division have been stopped. They cannot break the Canadian defense, and as the sun rises on April 25th, the Canadians can see the full extent of what they've accomplished. The slopes of Hill 677 are carpeted with Chinese dead, hundreds of bodies lying in rows where they fell during the attacks. The ground is churned up by artillery, and mortars trees are shrouded. The air the smells of cordite and death, and on the summit, 700 exhausted, filthy, blood-stained Canadian soldiers are still standing in their foxholes. They've been fighting for their lives all night. They're out of water. Most are wounded or injured in some way. They haven't slept in 2 days, but they held the line, did not break. Lieutenant Colonel Stone walks the position at dawn, checking on his men, congratulating them, making sure the wounded are being treated, when he reaches Lieutenant Levy's position in D Company. He finds Levy and his surviving men still in their foxholes, surrounded by spent shell casings and empty ammunition boxes, their faces blackened by gunpowder, and Stone says simply, "Well done. Lieutenant, you stopped them." But the battle isn't quite over yet. At 7:30 a.m. on April 25th, Stone receives intelligence that Chinese forces are regrouping in the valley for another assault They're not giving up. They're going to try again. And the Canadians, despite their incredible stand during the night, are in no condition to face another major attack. They're down to about 600 effective fighting men, after casualties. Ammunition is critically low again, and exhaustion is setting in, but reinforcement is finally coming. The U.S. 5th Cavalry Regiment has been ordered to counterattack up the valley and relieve the Canadians. At 10:00 a.m., American M4 Sherman tanks start rolling north with infantry riding on top. They're heading for Hill 6077. The Chinese spot the approaching Americans and about to between the Canadians on the hill and the Americans advancing from the south. The Chinese commanders make the decision to break contact and retreat north by noon on April 25th. By noon on April 25th. The Chinese forces have withdrawn from the Kapyong Valley. The threat to Seoul is over. The UN line has held, and 700 Canadian soldiers have achieved one of the most remarkable defensive victories in modern military history. The U.S. 5th Cavalry reaches Hill 677 at 1:00 p.m. When the American commander, Colonel Crombez, climbs the hill and sees the carnage, he's stunned. He finds Lieutenant Colonel Stone coordinating the evacuation of wounded and consolidating positions. Crombez asks Stone how many troops he had to hold off the Chinese, when Stone tells him, about 700 men. Crombez is speechless. He's seen the intelligence estimate of Chinese forces in the valley, at least 2 divisions toe the valley, at least 2 divisions totaling 20. With approximately 5 Zalosen directly engaged at Hill 677, and he cannot understand how such a small force held this position. Stone's response is pure Canadian understatement. We had good artillery support and the men did their job, but Crombez knows better. What the Canadians accomplished on Hill 677 was nothing short of miraculous. The Canadians are finally relieved late on April 26th after holding their position for nearly 3 full days as they march down from Hill 677 to march down for reserve positions. They pass columns of fresh American troops moving up to take over the defense. The Americans stand and stare as these Canadian soldiers walk past. Exhausted, filthy, bearded, with 1,000-yard stares, their uniforms torn and blood-stained, and the Americans spontaneously start applauding, some are saluting, because word has spread through the UN forces about what happened on the entire Chinese offensive. They saved Seoul from recapture in the UN line that could have led to the encirclement and destruction of multiple American divisions and multiple American divisions and multiple American divisions alone, surrounded, outnumbered 7-1, fighting through the night with no possibility of retreat or reinforcement. The final count is sobering. The 2nd Battalion PPCLI suffered 10 men killed in action and 23 wounded. Considering the intensity of the battle, these are remarkably light casualties and a testament to the excellent leadership and training of the battalion, the Australian 3, RAR, which fought the previous day on Hill 504, lost 32 killed and 59 wounded combined. The Commonwealth forces lost 41 killed and 82 wounded. But look at what they accomplished. Chinese casualties at Kapyong are estimated at 2,000 to 6,000 killed and wounded. With some sources suggesting the number could be even higher, the Chinese 118th Division was so badly mauled that it had to be withdrawn from the front for reconstitution. The 60th Division also suffered massive casualties. The entire Chinese spring offensive, which had been designed to capture Seoul and destroy UN forces, was stopped at the Kapyong Valley. Within a week, the Chinese offensive ground to a halt all along the front, having gained minimal ground at enormous cost. The UN forces stabilized their lines, and from that point forward the Korean War became a static conflict of patrols and limited attacks, while peace negotiations dragged on for 2 more years. But the decisive turning point was Kapyong. On May 17, 1951, President Harry Truman awards both 2 PPCLI and 3 RAR-Air the United States Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award the U.S. can give to foreign military units. It's the first time a Canadian unit has ever received this honor. The citation reads, "These units displayed such gallantry, determination and esprit de corps in accomplishing their mission under extremely difficult and hazardous conditions as to set them apart and above other units participating in the same campaign." The U.S. military, which had initially been skeptical of Commonwealth forces, now recognizes the Canadians and Australians as elite troops on par with the best American units. But here's what's truly incredible about this story. Back home in Canada, almost nobody hears about it. The Korean War is called the Forgotten War for a reason, while the battle is making headlines in Australian newspapers and military circles worldwide. In Canada, it barely gets mentioned. The men who fought at Kapyong come home to indifference. There are no parades, no public celebrations, no national recognition. They return to their civilian lives, get jobs, raise families, and most of them never talk about what they did on Hill 6 and 77. It isn't until decades later that Canadians start to understand the magnitude of the Battle of Kapyong. Military historians begin studying it. Realize this was one of the finest defensive battles in Canadian history, on par with Vimy Ridge in World War I and the defense of the Scheldt in World War II. In 2001, the Canadian government finally designates April 24th as Korean War Veterans Day, to honor those who fought, and many of the ceremonies focus specifically on Kapyong monuments are erected in communities across Canada, in Brampton, Winnipeg, Langley, Airdrie, Niagara Falls, all featuring stones quarried from Gapyeong County in Korea, where the battle was fought. The South Korean government donates these stones as a thank you to Canada for saving their country, and in Korea itself, there's a Canadian-Korean War Memorial Garden near Hill 677, where Korean veterans come each April 24th to honor the Canadian soldiers who stood and fought when others ran. But even with all this belated recognition, most Canadians still don't know the story. If you stopped random people on the street today and asked them about the Battle of Kapyong, 99% would have no idea what you're talking about. And that's a tragedy because this is one of the greatest military achievements in our nation's history. Here's what makes Kapyong so significant from a military standpoint. First, it demonstrates the absolute importance of leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Stone's calm, decisive command under impossible pressure, is a masterclass in battlefield leadership. He never panicked. He never wavered. And his confidence inspired his men to keep fighting when logic said they should run second. It shows the critical role of artillery support. The New Zealand gunners fired more than 16 Zalosen shells over 2 days in support of the Canadians. And that firepower was essential to breaking up Chinese attacks. Third, it proves that well-trained, led infantry in defensive positions can defeat much larger attacking forces through superior tactics, firepower, and determination. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, It demonstrates that sometimes the most important military objective isn't advancing or capturing ground. It's simply holding a position and refusing to give it up. Understood that Hill 677 was the key terrain dominating the approach to Seoul, and if the Chinese took that hill, they would pour through the Kapyong Valley and potentially encircle tens of thousands of UN troops. By holding Hill 677, changed the entire course of the Korean War. The broader strategic impact of Kapyong cannot be overstated. The Chinese sprint offensive was meant to be the knockout blow that would drive UN forces out of Korea and unite the counter-communist rule. Chinese commander Peng Dehuai had massed 700,000 troops of Infantry prize. His forces had broken our war lines and were advancing rapidly, and everything was saying rapidly over the turn flourished by living with and the gate precious time to scapula request and pouring water and the lubing and winter born is being which was surrounded and destroyed. But they bought time, and the Canadians and Australians at Kapyong did something even more remarkable. They didn't just delay the Chinese. They stopped them cold and threw them back. When Peng Dehuai received reports that 2 of his attacking divisions had been halted by a single Commonwealth brigade at Kapyong, he couldn't believe it. He assumed the reports were wrong, or that massive American reinforcements had arrived. But the reports were accurate. It really was just 700 Canadians on a hill, and they had just defeated his offensive. From that point forward, the Chinese never again attempted a major offensive to capture Seoul. They had shot their bolt. The spring offensive cost them somewhere between 50,000 and 85,000 casualties, and gained them almost nothing strategically. Mao Zedong, back in Beijing, was furious at the failure, and the Chinese military, which had been riding high after their victories at the Chosin Reservoir earlier in the war, was forced to admit they could not simply overwhelm UN forces with human wave attacks. The era of large-scale Chinese offensives was over. The war entered its final phase of static trench warfare and negotiation, and it all came down to places like Kapyong, where small numbers of highly trained, highly motivated Western troops proved that quality could triumph over quantity. Now let me tell you what happened to some of the men who fought that night. Lieutenant Colonel James Raleigh-Stone returned to Canada after his tour in Korea and continued his military career. Eventually retiring as a brigadier, he was appointed an officer of the Order of Canada in 1982 and spent his later years advocating for Korean War veterans and telling their stories. Stone always credited the men under his command for the victory at Kapyong, saying, "I just pointed them in the right direction. They did the fighting." He died in 2013 at age 95, and his funeral was attended by dozens of survivors from the battle. Lieutenant Levy left the military after Korea and became a successful lawyer in Toronto. For decades, he never spoke publicly about being denied wrecking position for calling artillery fire on his own position, an act of incredible bravery that saved not just his platoon, but possibly the entire battalion. And it was only one of the 30,003. When he was in his 70s, that he finally received some acknowledgement when Governor General Adrienne Clarkson granted him a coat of arms with the inscription, "Through artillery fire." Levy died in 2010 at age 82, and many Korean War veterans consider him one of the unsung heroes of Kapyong. Private Wayne Mitchell, who charged wounded into Chinese forces 3 times and earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal, returned to Ontario after the war and tried to resume normal life. But like many combat veterans, He struggled with what we now call PTSD. He had nightmares about the battle for years. Mitchell eventually found peace through connecting with other Korean War veterans and speaking at schools about his experiences. He wanted young Canadians to understand and freedom isn't free, and that sometimes you have to stand and fight. Mitchell died in 1993 for Kenneth Barwise. Barwise, who recovered the Vickers gun and earned the military medal, went back to Winnipeg and worked as a machinist. He rarely talked about the war, and most of his co-workers never knew he was a decorated war hero. It wasn't until his funeral in 2007 that many people learned about his exploit. Found even his medal tucked away in drawer. He would never even displayed them. And what about the 2nd Battalion, PPCLN? What about the 2nd Battalion and the CL as a unit? They continued fighting in Korea until the armistice in July 1953. They participated in many more battles and operations. But Kapyong remained their defining moment. Today, the battalion's now part of one PPCLI honors the Battle of Kapyong every April 24th with special ceremonies. The Battle Honor, KPIN, is emblazoned on their regimental colors. Entries in 77 alone against an entire Chinese army. Their predecessors stood alone against the entire Chinese army and refused to break the spirit carried. The combination of courage, determination, professionalism, and refusal to quit has become central to the regiment's identity. So here's what I want you to understand about the Battle of Kapyong and why it matters today. This wasn't some glorious cavalry charge or dramatic offensive. This was 700 Canadian soldiers, most of them barely out of their teens, sitting in muddy foxholes on a Korean hillside, scared out of their minds, watching thousands of enemy soldiers come at them out of the darkness, knowing they were completely alone, knowing there would be no reinforcements, no retreat, no rescue if they failed. And they didn't run. They didn't break. They stood their ground and fought with everything they had for 10 hours straight through the night. Some of them, like Wayne Mitchell, fought even after being wounded. Some of them, like Kenneth Barwise, ran toward danger instead of away from it. And some of them, like Mike Levy, made impossible decisions that could have killed their own men, but saved the entire position. These weren't superhuman warriors. They were ordinary Canadians. Farmers, mechanics, students, who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and rose to meet it. And here's the thing that really gets me. They did this knowing that most people back home would never hear about it, never appreciate it, never understand what they sacrificed. They didn't fight for glory or recognition. They fought because their buddies beside them were fighting, because their officers ordered them to hold, because they had a job to do, and they were damn well going to do it. That's the real story of Kapyong. Not heroes seeking glory, but professionals doing their job under the worst possible circumstances and doing it so well that they changed the course of a war. Today, in an era when Canada is debating its role in the world, when we're asking questions about military, spending, and defense commitments, and whether we should stand with our allies in dangerous places, the Battle of Kapyong provides an answer. It reminds us that sometimes small nations can have an outsized impact on world events. It shows that a well-trained, well-equipped, professional military force can achieve strategic objectives far beyond its size, and it demonstrates that when Canadians are given a mission and told to hold the line, We don't back down. The 700 men on Hill 677 sent a message that echoed around the world. Canada stands with its allies. Canada honors its commitments, and when Canadians are told, "This far and no farther," that line does not move. In 2023, during a visit to South Korea, I met a Korean War veteran named Park Jin. Soo, who had been a young soldier with the OK 6th Division in April 1951. He had been part of the retreat through the Kapyong Valley when the Chinese attacked. I asked him about the Canadians, and this 93-year-old man got tears in his eyes. He told me, "We were running, we were defeated. We thought the war was lost. And then we passed through the Canadian positions and saw these soldiers calmly digging foxholes and preparing to fight. They weren't running. They were staying. And I thought, if these foreigners who have no obligation to be here are willing to stand and fight for my country, then Korea has hope." Park Jin-soo said that image of the Canadians standing firm while his own forces retreated has stayed with him for more than 70 years, and he wanted every Canadian to know that South Koreans remember what those 700 men. They remember that Canada bled for Korean freedom, and they will never forget. So if you learned something from this story, this story. If it moved you, if it made you proud to be Canadian, I need you to do something for me. First, hit that subscribe button, because I bring you stories like this every week. Forgotten Canadian military history that deserves to be remembered. Second, share this video with everyone you know. These veterans and their families deserve recognition. And the only way that happens is if we spread these stories. Third, leave a comment telling me what you think. Did you know about Kapyong before this video? Do you have relatives who fought in Korea? What other Canadian military stories should I cover? And finally, if you encounter a Korean War veteran, thank them for their service. They fought in a forgotten war, but they shouldn't be forgotten veterans. They stood on hilltops in Korea so that we could live in freedom at home. They held the line when others ran, and they deserve our eternal gratitude. Remember, April 24th is Korean War Veterans Day in Canada. Mark it on your calendar and take a moment to remember Hill 677, 700 Canadians. One impossible night, and a stand that changed history. This is the story they never taught you in school. This is the battle that should be as famous as Vimy Ridge. This is the night that Canadians proved once again that we punch way above our weight when the chips are down. This is Kapyong, and this is why the Chinese learned to fear Canadian soldiers. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you in the next video, when I bring you another incredible story of Canadians at war.